Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Happy Hour with me. I am Eileen Cook, and this is the Creative Academy, and this is our chance to talk all things crafty. Today is November 27th, and I have absolutely no idea how it is already the end of November, but I'm just going to live in denial with that a little bit longer. And I thought an interesting thing to talk about as we were coming to the end of Nano, which I know many people have been working on, strangely enough, is taking us all the way back to the beginning and talking about beginnings. And that was for a few reasons. I've done a couple blue pencils, and in fact, I'll be doing a blue pencil in tonight's evening office hours if anyone is free. And recently doing a bunch of edits has had me thinking about openings and where we start a book and how we start a book. And of course, not to put too much pressure on it, but trying to fit absolutely everything possible into that. So when we're looking at an opening line or a paragraph, we're looking at things like voice, point of view, tone, setting. Like we're establishing a huge amount of context and material in a very short amount of time. So what I wanted to do is actually pull a couple openings and just sort of talk about them, because I think they're sort of intriguing. So The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. The first line is, "Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun." So that is that. The Martian by Andy Weir, which was originally indie published and eventually, as most people I think know, was picked up. I think it was by Simon & Schuster and then became a film with Matt Damon and whatnot. The first line is, and I'm quoting, "I'm pretty much fucked." So I think you can agree that that certainly does establish, certainly sort of, when you look at it, tone and voice. 1984 by George Orwell has one of my favorite opening lines. "It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. In terms of sort of astounding. And then one that a lot of people I think know from Anna Karenina, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." So we're talking about some really amazing opening lines with those kinds of things. And I think it becomes that intriguing thing about where do you start your own book and how do you sort of set that up? So the reason I think it's fun to talk about it now that we're at the end of November is I think a lot of times that we don't actually know our beginning until we know our ending. So I often will rewrite the beginning once I have finished the entire book. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. I think it's because, one, I don't really know, even though I outline, I think I have an idea of where the book is going to end, but I don't necessarily know exactly where the book is going to end until I get there. And then I'm looking to sort of have a nice feeling of completion. So sometimes when I know where it ends, I can sort of go back to the beginning and look at whether or not there needs to be more material, less material, if there's a way to kind of have some interesting echoes, those kinds of things. I think a lot of us, we write our way into a story. That is, we have an idea for what we want to do. We think we know what the book is going to be about, and we start writing. And again, I think this goes even for those of us who are outliners. So I know we have some pansters in the crowd. I don't know if this makes you feel better or not, but I think we're often still writing our way into it. I think that's just part of the process, is sort of writing that in. So that becomes a question of trying to figure out. And one of the things I was talking about with one person in a edit project was I felt that her book was starting too early. So the very first opening pages, really not a lot was happening. She was attempting to establish what she was doing, sort of the ordinary world, but it was so ordinary to, for me, I think not have, for a lot of readers, the patience to keep going. That is, there was nothing that was off or intriguing or sort of drawing me where I would be like, I absolutely need to keep reading and see what's going on. And I have to laugh because Carol has the same kind of dog that I do. So I keep looking over and thinking, why is my dog in Carol's lap? That's not right. It is completely wrong. I am going to encourage people, if you have questions or anything as I'm writing, or as I'm talking, either pop them into the chat window or just let me know that you have something, because I'm hoping that we can have sort of an interesting discussion about this. So as you're writing, what I would definitely do is don't worry too much about your opening until you're in that revision stage. Just get into the story and have a lot of faith that it's going to show up later. And then I think there's things that we can sort of think about different ways to sort of start or have an opening. So I just did some Googling around, because Google is our friend, and tried to look at different ways that people were getting into stories. And I kind of condensed it down into a couple of ways. So one is where people were trying to open with a really strong introduction to a character. That is, that the very first thing that they wanted to establish was that person and that voice and that sort of point of view that we were going to be in. So one of the examples I found was Catcher in the Rye, which is, if you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it. And I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. So I think in that kind of very short opening, they're really establishing who Colden Hawfield is and kind of his take and his tone, the feel. That's the voice that goes all the way through that book. And so right from the very get-go, you are being stuck and established in that. Now, I think there used to be a lot more books that opened with setting and place. And I just don't think I saw them as much. I was pulling books madly off my shelves last night as I was preparing all this and trying to see if I could find a book that sort of had a place opening that wasn't an older book. So things like, Portrait of an Artist and various things where they're definitely starting with sort of, the English countryside, or they're sort of giving you this, broad sweeping vista. And I didn't see as much of it. So I definitely saw a lot more people opening directly with character. Kind of the next thing, and I'm going to put this in for anyone who's thinking about sort of writing mysteries, is a lot of mysteries open with basically some type of either big, compelling event that's going to be crucial to the whole story, i.e. a murder, or some sort of memory of something sort of striking. So the book I pulled off my shelf was, I don't know if anyone's ever read The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, but their opening is, it was 7 minutes after midnight. The dog was lying in the grass in the middle of the lawn of Mrs. Shear's house. Its eyes were closed. It looked as if it were running on its side, the way dogs run when they think they're chasing a cat in a dream. But the dog was not running or asleep. The dog was dead. There was a garden fork sticking out of the dog. So that is, don't let your dog hear that story, Carol. Just cover his or her ears. The dog, nothing to hear here. That's the murder which sort of compels the character, which is the driving force of that story, is his attempts and efforts to sort of figure out what's going on. So if you're having a story that is driven by a singular event, that might be something that you want to open with. One of the ones that I think is particularly popular in commercial fiction at this time is some kind of ambiguous opening where it's just a little bit intriguing, where it's maybe a little bit mysterious or almost confusing. And by confusing, I don't want to talk about like where people are like, what the holy hell, but where it's sort of more like, that's sort of interesting. So one of my favorite books people know is I Love Gone Girl. And the opening line to Gone Girl is, when I think of my wife, I always think of her head, which I think is interesting. I read the George Orwell quote earlier, the clock striking 13. I think that's another example of where someone's going to have a little moment where they're going to pause and be like, wait, what? Clocks don't strike 13? And that's going to pull itself in. Fahrenheit 451 is, it was a pleasure to burn. It's a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. With a brass nozzle in his fist, with this great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world, the blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. So in that, I think he's doing what Don Moss often talks about. So Don Moss talks a lot in his about wanting to raise a question for the reader. And because he's Don Moss and because he's going to put all sorts of pressure on you, you know, his thing is like, can you raise questions with every single line that the reader is then going on to want to answer? That's a lot of pressure. I think it might drive me a little bit crazy to try and do that, but I do think there is a real value around, are you raising interest or intrigue where someone is like, I want to understand that better. So in this scene, unlike the clock striking 13, I understand it's about fire. I understand it's someone who enjoys fire, but I don't actually know what's being burned. And you certainly have this sense that the stakes are quite a bit higher. Sometimes there's prologues, and anyone who has been to Surrey knows that people have a great debate about prologues. Should they exist? Should they not exist? I certainly think you see them a lot, particularly in fantasy novels, if anyone is writing that. But there's something that the reader needs to know before the main action. Sometimes that's also a setup. One of my favorite books of all time is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. And I've recommended that book to people, and some people love it and some people just hate it. But the interesting premise of that book is, to a large degree, it is a murder mystery. Except the murder book, the story opens by telling you who's dead and who's done it. The question becomes why. So the opening line of that is, the snow in the mountains was melting and Bunny had been dead for several weeks before we came to understand the gravity of our situation. He'd been dead for 10 days before they found him, you know. And so what you end up finding out in just that very first prologue is that it's a group of friends at a college, and they have, in fact, murdered one of their friends. And the question is why? And that is what the entire book is about. So I think the author made the very conscious choice that you had to know that fact, because that was the setup of the entire book. There's another mystery novel by Minette Walters, who's a British mystery writer, and I don't have the book, unfortunately, anymore. I lent it to someone, which will teach you. Always write these things down. I lent it to someone and I never got it back, and I don't remember who I lent it to anymore. But the book opens with, and I can't remember the character's name, so I'm going to pick on Cynthia since she was here. But it was like, the book says something like, Cynthia Hewins had murdered Carol Thornton because she could not read. And then the book is all about, it's a class issue, so it's dealing with Cynthia, who is a maid and a servant who has killed someone, and it has to do with her inability to read. So they actually tell you the motivation, but they do not tell you basically what that motivation means. So it's sort of a mix, I think, of that ambiguous opening and a prologue. And then the last one, which is a little bit, again, I think similar to ambiguous, is just something that sort of startles people. I don't know if anyone ever read the book I Capture the Castle. It's an oldie, but a goodie. The opening line to that was, I write this sitting in the kitchen sink. So that, I think, again, is a line where it kind of makes you go, wait, what? So it's a little similar, I think, to ambiguous, but it's something that's just really startles people. I think The Martian's opening, I'm pretty much fucked, is an example of that. Again, where you're sort of seeing that. So I pulled some more openings because I started to get addicted to reading opening lines and thinking about it. Show of hands, how many people had to read The Great Gatsby at some point? Or you saw the movie, because the movie was also fabulous if you haven't. In my younger days and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. So when you sort of start deconstructing some of these, you start seeing all the heavy labor that is going into that. So one, we're setting up the point of view. So if you remember, The Great Gatsby is this very odd point of view because you're actually sort of an observer that is watching what's actually happening. in that story. It's obviously about class and money, and that is all being set up. And it's about judgment of people. Now, under the heading of, I think, surprising and maybe also ambiguous, I don't know if anyone read Middlesex by Jeffrey, and I'm going to butcher his last name, Eugenides.
Eugenides.
Thank you, Marianne. Say it one more time because you said it so lovely.
It's Greek. Eugenides.
Eugenides.
I mean, I'm probably kind of doing my own nasty version of it.
But I like the way you said it, so it works for me. So listen to this intriguing line. I was born twice, first as a baby girl on a remarkably smogless Detroit day in January of 1960, and then again as a teenage boy in an emergency room near Petoskey, Michigan in August of 1974. So it's a very interesting book, and I think that opening line sets up so much, and again is firmly establishing us in the point of view of the character. Under the heading of unexpected, and I think kind of again capturing the tone, which is also a nod. I don't know if people know that William Goldman, who wrote The Princess Bride, among other things, passed away very recently. One of my favorite books and favorite movies of all time. And the opening line of The Princess Bride is, "This is my favorite book in the world, though I have never read it." Which I think kind of sets you off. And again, when you read it, it's the kind of line that makes you stop and go back to it and think about it a little bit. Under the heading of very unexpected, I didn't know this book. It was on our bookshelf. It belonged to my husband, Crow Road by Ian Banks. And I actually thought it was, anyway, I thought it was a different book, but I opened it and then I've never read this book. I have no idea what it's about. But the opening line is, I had to write it down, was, "It was the day my grandmother exploded." So I don't know anything else about that book, but I have to sort of give the author a kudo that I suddenly was like, well, maybe I'm not just necessarily going to pass that back right away. I might have to take a peek at that one. One of the opening lines that I think probably people could quote along with me, Pride and Prejudice. "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." So some of us can probably echo that in our sleep. It's a line we all remember, but again, sort of setting up what this story is going to be about. Harry Potter. Mr. and Mrs. Durnsley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. Again, another great one. We'll do a quiz for this one. See if people know this from their English class. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. Carol raised her hand for Tale of Two Cities. So those of you also, let's just give a kudos for the amazing and epic use of commas in that particular one sentence, which is quite long and quite something.
That's one of the reasons I like the classics, even though it makes it less accessible, I think, to modern readers. Not wishing to discriminate or anything, but I love a long, complicated sentence with multiple subordinate clauses and commas everywhere.
And in commercial fiction, we have far less of those. And the reason is it actually forces you to slow down. I don't know if you noticed, I'm reading this off my laptop screen as I'm talking to you guys. And it's a ponderous sentence where you have to sort of slow down to make sure.
You've got to navigate it, and you've got to feel those pauses, right? Because they're important.
They're important. They're hugely important, and they matter, right? So I'm going to read it just one more time because I do think it's quite an incredible opening line. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. one sentence. So I don't know if you could necessarily get away with that if you weren't writing literary fiction anymore. But if you wrote it that well, you might just get away with it. A very short sentence, but also from a classic, Peter Pan. All children grow up. All children except one grow up. Which I think is a very intriguing opening. And again, you can imagine as a reader, you want to know who is that one. You guys can tell I was an English major because I have all these on my shelf. The Metamorphosis by Kafka. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. So one, Kafka writes weird in general, but I think that really works. Douglas Adams, we did Hitchhiker's Guide, but at the end of the universe, Restaurant at the End of the Universe, the opening line, the story so far, in the beginning, the universe was created. This is, in terms of sort of modern commercial fiction, I don't know if people read or have read Ann Tyler, but back when we were grown-ups, the opening line, I think, is fabulous. Once upon a time, there was a woman who discovered she had turned into the wrong person. That got an ooh from Cynthia. I really like that opening line. And when I unpack it for a minute or I think about it, I think it's because it sets up so many things, because it makes me want to know why does she think that she is the wrong person? What made her realize that she had turned into the wrong person? I think it taps into a universality as well, where I think a lot of us wonder, like, how did we get to this particular junction in our life, and how did we end up here, and trying to figure out if we're happy or not happy with that. So I think that makes a difference. The Color Purple by Alice Walker. You better not never tell nobody but God. That's another example where we're opening with voice, and we're also opening with sort of almost a little bit of sense of dread that there's going to be a secret, which there is. So I think that works. Again, a big book award winner was The Middle Passage, which the opening line is, of all the things that drive men to sea, the most common disaster I've come to learn is women, which I think has a little bit of nice. So I think that is my sort of collection, going through and looking at various books on my shelf around sort of opening lines. And it got me going back and sort of looking at my own books and sort of my own opening lines. And I do spend a fair bit of time. I like to sort of set that tone. I looked in fact, and pulled out The Hanging Girl, which was my most recent published mystery. And the opening line is destiny is like a boulder, bulky and hard to move. And what made me choose that opening line, because I can't actually ask any of the other authors, I don't sadly know them, and Dickens is a little bit beyond our ken of asking about that, is I wanted to talk about that the huge theme in that book is your fate predestined? That is, can you change things? Or are things just the way that they are? So the main character reads tarot cards. She feels like her life in a lot of ways is predestined because she was born to a teenage mom. Her mom was 15 when she was born. They live on the wrong side of the tracks. Her mom actually named her Candy with an I. And she talks a lot about, like, you're doomed when you're named Candy. Like, it's like your mom wants you to be a stripper or a Walmart greeter, because you never hear, like, this is my neurosurgeon, Candy. It's not something that happens. So she's sort of talking about all this effort that she is making to sort of try and change her life and who she's wanting to be. And what I was trying to do was pack all of that into one sentence. I am in no way arguing that it goes up there with Dickens or Annie Tyler's kind of opening line, but I do think it's a really interesting thing for us as we're writing to kind of go back and look at, are we getting our maximum bang for the buck? It also has to do with, I don't know if people know some of the research of how people buy books, but they actually have done some. So the very first thing that people will do is you buy a book by an author that you know that you love. So if you love Stephen King and Stephen King has a new book out, it doesn't really matter what the title is, what the cover is, what the book is about. You love his stuff, and so you're just going to go, trot yourself down to the bookstore and you're going to buy it. Or you love Nora Roberts, or you love, insert author's name here, but it doesn't matter what they write. You know that you're going to buy it. So that is the first thing that compels people to buy books. The second thing is a book that is coming strongly recommended from someone that you know. So a reliable source. And you can sort of, look at that and decide whether or not that is something that you want to do. So someone who says to you, oh my God, have you read The Secret History by Donna Tartt? I love that book. It was one of my favorite books. And you think, well, Eileen seems to read a lot of books. I'm going to check that book out and see whether or not that book appeals to me. That is the second thing that does that. But then if we start getting into books where you don't necessarily know the author and it hasn't come recommended to you, then you start getting into some challenging things. And one of the first things, of course, is title and cover. So we're going to give Cynthia a free plug. She just has a new cover. So hold it up again so we can all see it. First book. Woohoo! My grandmother's memoir, right? So the very first thing that you are trying to do is then to pull in somebody with that. The second thing someone will do is they'll take a look at something on the shelf. They'll take a peek at it. They'll flip it over or open it up to read the inside flap to see if the concept at all is intriguing to them. And then the next most common thing that people will do is they will read the first couple of lines. And I don't know if anyone else has had that experience where you're in a bookstore, but you flip open the book and you're reading those first couple of lines and you're making a decision about, that feels like something that I want to spend the next little bit with or not. So, and I have to chime in. So Carol's pointing out that her dental surgeon was named Bunny. And it was, it's actually on a certificate because my first thought was Bunny like a family name or whatever. But I also wonder, Bunny was something that strangely enough, wealthy people often called their kids, which strikes me as weird. Like in the 40s and 50s, Bunny was like a thing among the Tony, Kennedy crowd kind of thing. So maybe he's just appealing. Maybe your dental surgeon is, fancy schmancy and you just never knew it. But I do think names are that kind of great thing around. They do sort of set up an expectation where, I think, having just had surgery, if my surgeon had said to me, my name is Candy, I might have just had a moment where I would be like, okay. I would have a hard time taking someone seriously, I think, with that name. But that just might be. But that is what I wanted to sort of bring up and for us to talk about was openings. And I'm curious if anyone wanted to share their opening line. All right, looks like Cynthia's volunteering. She nodded. That was a critical mistake.
Well, since you already plugged my thing, I'll read you the first line of my grandmother's memoir. Not everyone gets to hear their grandmother's voice from beyond the grave, so I considered myself fortunate the day it happened to me. That's my first line.
All right, so I'm curious what other people think of that line. I love it. And Cynthia's also taking a huge deep breath because it's too late to change it now. But I think, again, for me, that sets up one, it's an intriguing first line. When we talk about the idea, not everyone can hear their grandmother's voice from beyond the grave. It makes me want to know, how did you hear it from beyond the grave? What was going on with that? And I think it sort of sets up that sort of story thing. And and Marie put in the thing, it pulls the reader in. I think you'd have a hard time, someone who wouldn't want to be at least want to read the next couple of lines to sort of see if the story continues to sort of hold and intrigue me. And I think what's really valuable to bring up is you're writing memoir. So I think sometimes we think this only applies when we're writing fiction. Like this is only about, having to have a novel that has a certain kind of intriguing opening. And I don't think that that's true. I think that nonfiction, particularly these days, as more of us are reading, nonfiction has sort of exploded on the market, particularly when we start talking about like what they sometimes will call narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction, where, you're seeing things like Unbroken and various things where people are being pulled along and reading it more like a novel versus like a research text, that we're still wanting that to be really, really intriguing. Anyone else have an opening line that they're maybe not sure about? Carol.
For the past hundreds of years, ships and women have been considered the sole property of men.
I think that is interesting as well. Tell us a little bit about what the book is about. Like, where are you? I guess, like, have you finished a draft? Or are you all the way through? What's going on?
Well, I've done all the research. Well, not all the there is no end to research.
That is the truth.
It just keeps growing. However, I have done a lot of the research. I have written a very academic first draft, and I'm now starting on the second draft, which I'm now trying to turn into something people will read. And I believe you may have seen the letter I sent as a part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's where I'm at with this.
I think
it's going to be a long process, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's I keep hoping like it's going to be a shorter process. Like, I've worked on a lot of books, and I keep thinking at some point I'm going to get to a point where it's like, oh, I actually know how this works, and it'll speed up. But I have yet to find that process. So I think that's really, sort of interesting. Cynthia, you have a comment.
I love that, Carol. And I just wanted to say that I think it lends itself to a little bit of humor. And I wonder if maybe you can find a way to work something into that, because I feel like there must be a lot of jokes that sailors or fishermen or whoever tell about their wives in their boats, or how they're sort of, one and the same in their mind. So I don't know how serious your academic book is, but I feel like it sort of lends itself to some kind of humor. I mean, like Well,
and I think that's going to be the really interesting thing, because I think you could take that line two ways, because I think it could have humor, and it also has a sense to me of dread. So if you're a woman, that you can be owned by someone. And maybe in this age of, Handmaid's Tale and so forth, where I find that so incredibly creepy. But yeah, I think there's an interesting way, and I think that's the idea of sort of having the opportunity to sort of have an opening line, and then where you go with it is going to really set the tone and feel for that.
And I mean, it's unfortunate, particularly in the world of seafaring. There is not much work done on women because nobody looked for them.
Yeah.
They weren't supposed to be there. They were there. They were pirates. They were wives. They were sailors. They were stewardesses. They were workers. They owned ships. They financed ships, and they had ships built.
Yeah.
But they have been completely obliterated from the historical record because they weren't supposed to be there.
And what's interesting, Carol, is when, because Carol has submitted pages to the Blue Pencil for Crystal, Donna, and I, so we all had a little sneak peek. And it was interesting when I first read it, because I always read them twice. So I read them just going through, and then the second time. And when I first read it, I was like, oh, well, she has a character on a ship, but I don't think women were on ships. And that was kind of my initial thought. And then it occurred to me, because I happen to know that Carol's kind of a smart cookie, like, Carol probably did a little bit of research on that. And if there were no women on ships, I don't know if she would have done this. So for me, it was this thing around, and I think historical is that idea of opening up a window to a world that you don't necessarily know. And I think that's why so many people read historical fiction, is to have history come to life in a way. So I'm going to scroll up for a second in the chat window because Marianne asked a question. She said, do you think there's different genre expectations? I feel like romance, mystery, science fiction expect to start with a character and action, and at the opening line raise story questions and pull the reader in rather than make an abstract thematic statement. I don't know. I would say there's definitely different genre expectations for sure. And I would definitely say that in general, most genre is wanting to pull readers in relatively quickly. And I think something needs to be happening, particularly in kind of genre fiction where the reader is not going to stand or sit for a long period of time of sort of opening. But I don't think that you necessarily have to necessarily open with character, that it can be a little bit abstract or vague as long as you're not spending too long in that time period. Or it might be something that the character is saying that is then reflecting, because, you know, the destiny line from the Hanging Girl is a lot like it's an interior thought by the character, but it is a thematic statement as well. It's just she doesn't know she's making a thematic statement. And then I just wanted to make sure that Carol saw Marie commented in the comments that your opening line sort of has authority because it calls on the past. So I do think, it is that idea of whenever we say a long time ago or once upon a time or hundreds of years ago, we have that. So Janine, thankfully she typed hers in, so I'm going to read this. The leaves had been swirling to the ground for 2 weeks, cloaking the city streets in a smattering of oranges, reds, and yellows, when I climbed off the bus and walked into the past to Toronto's Rosedale. Intriguing. So yeah, this was one which I think like it's getting really visual. So it's setting us up, it's fall. And of course, automatically, I always encourage people to realize that whatever you say with settings is going to have a feel for people. So whenever I think of fall, I think of coming winter. Some people think of endings, those kinds of things. So it's sort of, that has an intriguing opening. Ginny, do you want to pop on and tell us a little bit about what the book is about?
So it's actually one of those things that's not quite a book yet because it's getting to be a longer and longer short story. So, but it's basically a story about around the 1980s in Toronto where everything was changing, and people were coming in from Vancouver and from the West Coast, East Coast. Everybody was going to Toronto because that's where the jobs were back then, right? Yeah. And so the only places that really weren't changing were places like Rosedale, which is a very wealthy part of town, and it has the status quo, and it's got sort of this setup. So the story's about a young woman who is caregiving people in the Rosedale area, but she actually lives outside. So she has this weird place where she goes where everything is looking after these elderly people in their own homes so they can stay in their own homes in Rosedale. But outside in her real world, everything's falling apart. She's fighting places to live and things like that. So it's kind of anyway, that's where it's going. But she ends up, she's just there temporarily because she just has to prove to her mother that she only has to be, like that she, after 6 months, she still really will be in love with her fiance and she really will want to go back. But she's 21 and so, or 19 or so she doesn't really know. Yeah, anyway.
You can be older and not know. I can tell you that. But yeah, I think
but you know what, her life's going to change because she's
yes.
Like, he's staying there in the small town where they came from, and she's experiencing the city. And yeah, anyway.
And I think what'll be really interesting around all of that is if your first line changes when you finish the story. Because what's most intriguing to me about that line is walking into the past of Toronto's Rosedale. Like that's what makes me kind of like twinges my little antenna and makes me go like, I'm definitely intrigued by that. I want to know a little bit more about that. And I think the question will be, and part of that will be thinking about what it is you're accomplishing with the story. And so, you know, is that where you want, like, it's definitely intriguing. Like, is that where you want the reader to sort of start thinking about, like, is it about the past and changes and those kinds of things? And if you're like me, you don't actually know at this point, or I have some ideas, but I don't necessarily know where they're going to be.
Yeah, I'm kind of realizing I'm more of a pantser than a plotter. I
Huh.
try. I really, really try to plot, and then it just falls apart.
It doesn't fall apart, it evolves. That is the term I like to use.
It goes in directions, and I'm like, can you just come back here and just stay where I was going? Just, it would be faster if you would just stay here, but it doesn't want to do that.
Yep. And I think that will definitely sort of pull people in.
Yeah.
I'm going to pull to Scott's opening line, which is the shorts and the Batman t-shirt on the floor, or the khakis and button up hanging in my closet. So I think that's telling us a lot about character in a very short period of time. Because right off the bat, we see that the shorts and Batman t-shirt are what's worn, and the khakis are what's hanging up, and therefore probably not worn. And again, I have a little bit of a unfair advantage because I've actually read this book that Scott's been working on, so I kind of know where things are going. But fundamentally, this is a coming of age story. This is about a character deciding who he wants to be as a young man and making choices about what's important to him. And what's interesting is that is echoed in this line, right? Because if you sort of think about it, it's the difference between childhood and adulthood. So khakis and button up are kind of what we're wearing now, the childhood outfit. And it's also having to make a choice about which one you want to do. I don't know if that was intentional, Scott.
That's a lot of times I don't put a lot of thought into it. But yeah, it was intentional more from the case, from my point, that the khakis and the button up are what his mom wants him to wear.
Yeah.
And he wants to wear what's comfortable. And
yes,
he's at that age where he's kind of wearing these nerdy clothes, but doesn't know that they're nerdy clothes.
And I think what's interesting is, and I know a few people had seen this, I recently had a wonderful review in and I'm going to screw it up, the Ottawa Review of Books, where they pointed out in With Malice, one of my characters' names is Jill Sharon. And that Sharon is the mythical character that carries people from the underworld across the river Styx. And therefore, what I was clearly showing was that this character was kind of riding this line between life or death. And then I had this totally awkward moment where I had to admit to people that it's actually just named after a friend of mine named Kelly Sharon, and I used her last name because she read like 7,000 versions of this book. And so I wanted to give her a nod, and she'd, had said that she would love to have a character named after her. So that is totally where it came from. So sometimes people read things in our lines where we're like, that isn't necessarily, I wasn't trying to be as deep as that sort of turned out to be. So that's why I asked Scott, like, if it was an intentional thing or not. But I think what's interesting is it does work on that. So whether or not that's your brain working overtime in places that you didn't necessarily expect, but it certainly does sort of show up in that, around that idea of making choices, choosing what other people want versus what you want, growing up, not growing up, all of those things kind of end up being echoed in that opening line, which I think works really well. So whenever we can get more bang for buck, there you go.
It also, though, doesn't use the cliche of like a black leather jacket versus a white hat or something, like that. Yeah, it's better, I think, in a lot of ways, because we have so much dichotomy right now in this world where it's either good or evil, that it's just really nice to see gray or red or blue,
a little bit of that,
some other color. Yeah.
Now, Marianne, is this your opening line?
One of them. The others were not worthy of this discussion.
So at first I was like, is she saying that all these things are in Scott's first line? Because I don't see it. No. Religion, rebellion, sex? No, it's just a Batman shirt, Marianne.
It's this one.
Can you tell us what the book is about?
Well, the opening line is internal thought of the character as she's, just after she's sort of made an epiphany about how to complete her PhD thesis. So it's in reference to her thesis, but it also it is that the theme of the whole book.
Yeah.
And I realized I did it this time, but I don't usually. I usually feel more like I need to begin with character and action and.
Well, and it's not bad, like for clarity, like beginning with character, and like all I'm trying to get with this is that you are really thinking carefully about how you open, knowing that that is kind of the very first thing that the reader's looking at and they're imprinting on it, or being careful that you're not setting up, like, for example, so I haven't read this book of yours, Marianne, Religion, Rebellion, Sex. It had the makings of a bestseller. So for me, there's a hint to me that there's going to be a little bit of humor in this book. Not that it's a funny book, but that there's a little bit of, I don't know what, flip attitude, sort of sarcasm. Like there's something there that if this suddenly turned into a book that was really dark and about child abuse and those kinds of things, I would feel almost lied to. Or that you led me astray in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, I think I'm going to be looking for religion, rebellion, and sex, even though, again, it's an interior thought. It's sort of setting up that these are going to be big things.
Well, in the heroine's mind, she's thinking about her thesis, but it turns out the story is about her life and how those things intersect. And so she transforms, in relation to those things. So her thesis is carrying her forward, but she meets a sexy Italian guy. So it's a lighthearted romance with this sort of symbolic thesis theme that runs through it all, because it's what pulls her forward, but it has these layers, right? So anyway, yeah. So I guess the thesis, the theme of the book and the theme of her thesis end up being parallel. But yeah, anyway, so.
Thumbs up is what you get from me on that. So, I mean, the big, kind of pulling all things together is there's obviously a whole bunch of different ways that you can open a book, but thinking really hard about how much can you accomplish in kind of that, I'm not even going to say first line, although if you can pack it all into a first line, good on you. But that sort of, first couple of lines, like, are you establishing sort of the voice and the feel of the book? Are you giving any sort of indications to sort of tone or setting so that people sort of, have a sense of what that might look like? Are you pulling the reader in? Are you, raising a question or something that they're necessarily going to want to know? Are you sort of setting up, the entire book in one line? If you could just do that, you're doing great. And the reason I brought this all up today is as people are kind of coming to their end of their nano or, in general, working on manuscripts, I 100% just want to suggest to people that openings, like, don't be discouraged if you don't feel like you have it. You may need to try different openings, both where you're opening, like, are you opening in the right place? But, do you have it? And I think we sometimes think that openings have to be like explosive, that they have to be these like, the clock ticked down, the world was about to end. And the problem is sometimes those big explosives don't necessarily pull the reader in either, because they have nothing to hang on to at that point. But lots of little tinier hooks will pull people in and make them, want to know a little bit more. And a little bit more is never a bad thing. That is my big call on openings for today. So people who are going to attend this evening's office hours, we have a blue pencil. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is actually opening in that, because I have some thoughts about whether or not it's a book that has magic in it, like how early to introduce the magic. So I'm hoping that will be an interesting sort of discussion around that kind of stuff. And for now, we have a few minutes. Does anyone have any questions about openings, or for that matter, anything else? Questions, concerns, things they want to know? Dead silence.
Back to the drawing board.
There you go. Get those opening lines right. All right. So just a reminder, there are office hours tonight. And then next week for December, I am switching. So my Tuesday morning office hours are switching to Wednesday morning. So it'll be Tuesday night, same time, 5 o'clock. Wednesday morning, same time, new day, 5 o'clock. All right. Lovely to see you. Sleep well, Cynthia, on the other side of the world where it's nighttime. And everyone else, have a great day.
So Eileen.
Bye, everyone.
Yes. It's Janine. I just wondered if you got my pages or not.
Yes.
You did. Okay.
You're the bigger one, the 25 pages?
No, it's 10. I sent it through you through.
Oh, yes, the short story. Yes, I have it. And I will get it back to you.
Okay. I just wasn't sure if I did it right. All
right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Let's go next. Here we go. How are you guys holding that?